Welcome to session 3 of our Bible survey course. My name is Stephen Clybourne. I am the senior pastor at Earl Street Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina, and we are continuing our survey of the Bible and are now in session 3. We will be talking today about the period of time known as the patriarchal period, and we will be covering pages 7 and 8 on the in the study guide. I'm trying to get my technology working here. Hold on one second. There we go. Pages 7 and 8. If you don't have the study guide, you can find it on our website at esbcgreenville.org under the Resources tab. And today we're going to be looking at Genesis 12 through 50, which will cover the period of time somewhere around or between 1800 and 1700 BC. Genesis 1 through 11, as we have seen, tells the story of creation, how sin entered the world, how sin continued to degenerate and become more pervasive during the prehistorical period. And these chapters, of course, ended in chapter 11 with the nations being scattered over the face of the whole earth. There's mass confusion and mass chaos. The people are not able to understand each other's languages. And these chapters end with no hope of redemption. But with the calling of Abraham in Genesis 12, beginning with verse 1, we see that God was at work to redeem the world, the whole universe that has now deteriorated, that God is going to redeem this fallen, confused, hopeless creation from sin through just one nation. The one who created heaven and earth now creates a people. And that people is going to be fathered by Abraham. The word patriarch actually means the father of a nation, or the male head of a long family line. The patriarchs, or sometimes called the first fathers of Israel, were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. These were semi-nomadic people who were first called Hebrews in chapter 14, verse 13. And of course, at that time, when the term Hebrews was used, it referred to a class of people, second-class citizens who owned no land. And eventually, the term came to refer to a whole race of people known as the Israelites. Now, as we will see as we move through these stories, within each generation, certain individuals belonging to the very same ancestral stock, that is, descendants who descended from Abraham, are kind of dropped out of the picture, dropped out of the privileged line of descent. People such like Lot, the father who became the father of the Moabites and the Ammonites, Ishmael, who became the father of the Arabs, the sons of Abraham by his concubines who were sent away eastward to the east country, and Esau, who became the father of the Edomites. All of these were descendants of Abraham and technically were recipients of the same promise that God gave to all of Abraham's descendants. But for the purposes of the narrative focus of the Old Testament, they become kind of marginal in their influence. The patriarchs of Israel were, as I said, semi-nomadic people. Unlike pure nomads, certain areas served as home base for them. And in the planting season, they would settle in some fertile spot to plant and tend their crops, and then follow their flocks to other pasture lands after the crops had been harvested. Abraham's father, Terah, came from Ur, as we mentioned in the first session when we went over our geographical introduction, which was in eastern Mesopotamia, Ur of the Chaldees, as it was called. And then he came from Ur to Haran, which was in Padan Aram. If you want to push pause and find those locations on your Bible map, then you'll have some kind of geographical frame of reference about where this story begins in terms of geography. But in terms of when this story begins, it's important to look at some of the factors that help scholars assign some general dates to the history of the patriarchs. First of all, there were some excavations in 1925 in northwest Mesopotamia in a place called Nuzi, which uncovered some 20,000 clay tablets that reflect similar laws and customs reflected in the patriarchal narratives. Nuzi is located somewhere near Nineveh, near the Tigris River. And these findings were fascinating because they are ancient, extra-biblical, non-biblical sources that corroborate a lot of the customs and stories that are included in the patriarchal narratives. For example, the ways of signing a contract by splitting animals open and wringing birds' necks. That custom is reflected in Genesis 15:7-11. Nuzi law permitted a sonless man to adopt a son-in-law. And apparently it was under that kind of law that Laban adopted Jacob in Genesis 29. Nuzi law we find from those clay tablets that were excavated permitted a childless couple like Abram and Sarai, for example, to adopt a son like Eliezer. But if they eventually had children, the adopted son would lose all of his rights. That custom is reflected in Genesis 15:1-6 and corroborated with the Nuzi clay tablets. Nuzi law required a barren wife to provide her husband with a handmaid to bear children. So Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham. We see that in Genesis 16:1-4. Rachel gave Bilhah to Jacob. We see that in Genesis 30:1-8. And Nuzi law forbade the mistreatment of expulsion of the handmaid of her children if the wife should later bear children. And this would explain Abraham's reluctance to send Hagar and Ishmael away after the birth of Isaac. So the point is that these Nuzi tablets, these clay tablets that were discovered in Nuzi in 1925, are so ancient that they actually corroborate the historicity of the events that are described in the patriarchal narratives. We also have another way of dating the patriarchs because of Egyptian records. And we know that the Pharaoh under whom Joseph rose to power was a Hyksos king, and we know that that Hyksos king lived in the time frame of 1700 to 1570 BC. Most Old Testament scholars have concluded that the Pharaoh under whom Joseph rose to power was one of those Hyksos kings, which would date the Joseph story somewhere in that time frame between 1700 and 1570. Another way that we can kind of give a general time frame to the dates of the patriarchs is that Abram's journey from Ur of the Chaldees seems to be consistent with the movement of the Amorites from Mesopotamia into Palestine in the 19th and 18th centuries BC. Again, all of these are extra biblical historical records that seem to corroborate the historicity of the biblical narratives of the patriarchs, and also actually help us to assign a general historical framework. Well, let's look right at how the patriarchal narratives begin in chapter 12, actually beginning with chapter 11, verse 31, and moving through chapter 12, verse 20. If you have a Bible, you might want to go ahead and find that passage where the Lord calls Abram. So this story, remember, comes right on the heels of the story of the Tower of Babel, and it becomes God's answer to the confusion and chaos that resulted from the Tower of Babel experience. And God promises Abraham two things that Abraham did not have: land and descendants. We're going to get back to that. But first of all, I want you to notice that with this story, we see introduced a theme that is going to recur over and over throughout the Old Testament. And that is the theme of God's sovereign election on the one hand and Abram's free will on the other. It is clear as you read this story that the Lord takes the initiative by giving the promise. It is clear that the Lord is orchestrating these events, and that's what we mean by saying the Lord is sovereign, and the Lord elects or chooses, picks out Abram. But there is a point in the story where the scripture says, so Abram went. So there is a point at which Abram is choosing, making choices to cooperate with what God is doing. So God's initiative and promise was to give Abram two things he didn't have. First, a land to call home. Remember, Abram was a semi-nomad, which meant that he didn't really have roots anywhere. He didn't have a place to settle. And so the Lord promises to give him a land to call home and promises to give him descendants. Abram was old by this time, had no descendants, and had no hope of having any descendants. So we're going to see, as these stories unfold, a theme that is going to develop, a theme of promise and fulfillment. The promise is the Lord's going to give Abram land, and the fulfillment will come when Abram's descendants claim that land as their own. But the Lord is also going to promise Abram descendants, and the fulfillment will be when Abram starts to father children. But there will almost always be in these patriarchal narratives an interruption between promise and fulfillment, some kind of formidable obstacle that serves to intensify the theme. And often the obstacle, at least in the patriarchal narratives, is the barrenness of the matriarchs. So the Lord promises Abram descendants, but Abram's wife, Sarah, is barren. Same with Rebecca, same with Rachel. So there's a promise and a fulfillment, but between the promise and fulfillment is an obstacle. As I said, if you look at Genesis 12, 1 through 4, you see that the Lord promises to make of Abram a great nation and to make his name great so that he would bless other nations. So the Lord promises Abram that I'm going to pick you out. I'm going to give you some kind of chosen status, but I'm going to bless you not so that you can feel superior. I'm going to bless you so that you and your descendants can be a blessing to all the nations, all the families of the earth. And then verse 4 says, so Abram went as the Lord told him. And we are left to wonder, could Abram have made a different choice? We don't know. But we know that Abram at a certain point made the choice to cooperate with God. God calls him, God chooses him. It is almost as if, like in one of those Google Earth, the things that we see on the news, you know, where the news might be talking about a story in Greenville, South Carolina. but the satellite starts at a real high view of the whole Earth and then just kind of narrows in, finally focuses in on one specific location. That's the way I picture the movement from Genesis 11 to Genesis 12. Genesis 11 pictures the whole world in chaos, and then Genesis 12 pictures the camera zooming in on just one person in one location. And so God is making it happen. God is orchestrating. God is operating. But then at a certain point, Abram is cooperating, making his own choice. Abram has been given a certain measure of freedom. And this tension between the choices that God makes and the choices that human beings make, that tension is never resolved in the Bible. How it is that God can be sovereign and human beings can still be free is a tension between predestination and so-called free will that theologians have never been fully able to resolve. We see in chapters, we see in this call of Abraham that the call of God is not just to Abraham, but also through Abraham to the world. And sometimes when the Jewish people got it wrong, they started feeling like they were called and chosen and elected because they were supposed to be special in the sense that they were privileged and superior, but they were called from the very outset. We see from these first 4 verses that they were called in order to call others. They were blessed in order to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. In chapters 13 through 16, we see the importance of the covenant, which was an agreement or treaty binding 2 parties together. The whole Bible from this point on is going to be organized around this idea of covenant. The Old Covenant or the Old Testament and the New Covenant in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, God's people was Israel. In the New Testament, God's people were the church. Might have gotten my grammar wrong in those sentences. But the idea is that God has always had a people and God has always been determined to have a family. And so we see this idea of covenant established. And the covenant that God makes with Abram in this generation will be repeated and renewed with each successive generation. And we're also going to see how this kind of back and forth pattern between conflict and covenant works itself out. In chapter 13, both Abram and his descendant Lot had many cattle as they divided up the territory. And Lot took the Jordan Valley, the Jordan Rift, if you remember from session 1 in your geography, and Abram took Canaan. The covenant was then repeated to Abram in chapter 13, verses 14 through 18. Then there was a conflict between Abram's small force and an alliance of 4 kings. And then again, the covenant was repeated and there was a covenant ceremony. And in that covenant ceremony is this very important verse that gets introduced here. It's almost a verse that you would overlook otherwise, but it gets picked up in the New Testament as one of the real pinnacle statements of theology. And that is in chapter 15, verse 6. After the Lord repeated his promise to Abram, the scripture says, Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And then Abraham responds with a covenant renewal ceremony. But that idea that Abram was regarded as righteous, not so much based on his performance, not so much based on his ability to obey completely, but based on his faith. He believed the Lord, and just his belief became the basis for the Lord regarding Abraham as righteous. In chapter 16, we see the birth of Ishmael as evidence of the fact that God hears the cry of Abram, who has no heir to receive the promise of God. And so Ishmael is one of those characters who's born of Abraham and inherits the promise of Abraham's descendants, but becomes marginalized by the Hebrew scriptures. In chapter 17, we see the idea of circumcision introduced, and that, of course, becomes a major theme from this point on in the Old Covenant and in the New Covenant, as it is picked up in the New Testament. The sign of circumcision was, of course, a sign of the covenant, that whoever was circumcised, the males who were circumcised, were identified as the people who would inherit the promise that God made to Abraham. In chapters 18 and 19, we read the story as surrounding the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, in which Abraham interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah, but to no avail, and basically says, I know things are bad, but Lord, if I can find 50 righteous people, will you spare the cities? And the Lord said yes, and then he can't find 50, so he says, all right, well, what about 40? And then goes down to 30 and 20 and 10. But there were not even 10 righteous people in the whole area. So the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his daughters narrowly escaped, and you might remember his wife turning into a pillar of salt because she looked back when she should have been looking ahead. Then Lot's daughters get him drunk and then have his children, and then Lot's children, his descendants, become the Moabites and the Ammonites. I will say that a lot of these stories are not going to be child-friendly. My children were adults before I wanted to talk to them about some of these stories. In chapter 20, we see Abraham and Sarah in Gerar. And then in chapter 21, the birth of Isaac and the promise to Isaac and Ishmael. Although Isaac was designated to continue Abraham's line, Ishmael too was promised a future. And you can read about the distinctions and the similarities between God's promises to Isaac and Ishmael. And these promises are at the heart of a lot of the conflict that is still in the Near East, in this part of the world, between Jews and Muslims. Jews, the descendants of Isaac; Muslims, the descendants of Ishmael, and both legitimately claim that Abraham is their father, and this land that the Lord promised to Abraham and his descendants belongs to them. And that's why they fight over that land. It's essentially a religious fight, a biblical fight, in their interpretation of the events. And the crux of the matter is in chapter 21. You remember the really disturbing story in chapter 22 in which the Lord tests Abraham's faith by asking him to slay or sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham is just about to do it. And when the Lord sees that Abraham is willing to do it, the Lord provides another way for the sacrifice. So Abraham doesn't have to sacrifice his son. But many of us, look at this story and it's hard for us to understand why the Lord would ask anyone to sacrifice their own son. Then in chapters 25 through 28, we see the hyphen. We see the hyphen between Abraham and Jacob as Isaac is often called, because you just don't really get a lot of information about Isaac in the Bible. Isaac receives the least attention of all the patriarchs. He seems to be this shy, quiet, meditative person who's dominated by his wife, Rebekah. But the covenant which the Lord made with Abraham was reaffirmed with Isaac. It's just that we don't see too much about Isaac, except in the way that Isaac figures into the story of Jacob, who is a very major character in chapters 25 through 49. Isaac and his wife had twin sons who were rivals in the womb. And these sons were Jacob and Esau. And because Esau was actually born first, he was technically first in line to be the patriarch, to be the receiver of the blessing from Isaac. This was his so-called birthright, something he could expect because he was the firstborn. It was his right simply because of the order of his birth. Now, the birthright was formally given to the son by the father as he approached death. The birthright was not Esau's officially until Isaac formally bestowed his blessing upon Esau. Once the blessing was pronounced, it was irrevocable because one's spoken word was one's bond in that culture. So this sets the stage for these very fascinating, interesting stories about Jacob and Esau. Jacob was the name Jacob, Yaakov in Hebrew, means supplanter or schemer, and Jacob certainly lived up to his name. The tradition recorded in 25:19 through 26 was that Jacob had a hold of Esau's heel when Esau was being born, trying to pull him back so that Jacob could come out of the womb first. The name Esau means hairy, H-A-I-R-Y, and he was a more rough and rugged man than Jacob, and he was this outdoorsman. And then, of course, there's Rebekah, who is Isaac's strong-willed wife, and Jacob and Esau's strong-willed mother, and Rebekah's favorite son clearly was Jacob. So first, you might remember the story. You can read about this in 25:29 through 34. Jacob took advantage of Esau's hunger one day and his exhaustion by offering him some fresh bean soup in exchange for his birthright. And then he caught Esau in a moment of weakness and hunger. Most of us will do almost anything once we get hungry or hangry, as we sometimes say. So then Jacob went after the blessing that was rightfully Esau's, with the help of his mother Rebekah, who's planned and schemed with him. Because Isaac's eyesight was failing him, Isaac mistakenly gave the blessing to Jacob, thinking he was Esau. And of course, there were all kinds of tricks to make him think that. When Esau found out that Jacob had stolen his birthright and blessing, he threatened to kill Jacob. But then Rebekah helped Jacob to escape by sending him to her brother Laban's house in Haran. And on the way to Haran, Jacob had a dream. And this dream ended up changing his life. Sorry about that. I had to make a little adjustment. And this dream, you might remember, was of a ladder that was reaching from earth to heaven with angels ascending and descending the ladder. And in that dream, the Lord reaffirmed the promise to Jacob, which he had made initially with Abraham and then successively with Isaac. And through that dream, the God of Abraham and Isaac became experientially the God of Jacob too. secondhand religion was now replaced by firsthand encounter, as Jacob encountered the presence of the Lord in that dream and woke up in chapter 28, verse 16, and said, surely the Lord was in this place, is in this place, and I did not know it, but I know it now. Upon arriving in Haran, in this most regrettable and unfortunate but comical story, Jacob fell in love with his cousin, who was Laban's daughter. And her name was Rachel. But before Laban would give Rachel to be married to Jacob, Laban made Jacob work for 7 years. Now, that by itself shows how much Jacob wanted to be married to Rachel. But then after the 7 years passed, Laban did an end around, did a sneak pick, and gave Jacob, not Rachel, but Leah, Rachel's older sister. Now, don't ask me how he did not realize he was marrying the wrong sister. But there was some point, and we can only guess at what point, but there was some point at which he realized that he had married the wrong woman. So then Jacob had to work 7 more years before Laban would give his daughter Rachel to Jacob in marriage. This shows how much Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, and it makes us all feel sorry for Leah, whom Jacob did not want to marry. The deceiver himself, Jacob, who had deceived his father into giving him the blessing, now had found someone, his own uncle, Laban, who could beat him at his own game of deception. But by his 2 marriages with his 2 cousins, Jacob had, and some of their handmaids thrown in there, Jacob ended up having 12 sons in this order. And I won't read all their names, but you can look at the list and see that he had some of these children by Leah, who was his first wife, some by Rachel, and some by Leah's handmaid, and some by Rachel's handmaid. 12 sons in all. And those sons later became the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, who later participated in the conquest and settlement of Canaan and traced their ancestry. These tribes traced their ancestry to the 12 sons of Jacob. Now, the tribe of Simeon seems to have dropped out of this number at an early date, according to Deuteronomy 33, 6 through 25. We'll see more about that later when we get to Deuteronomy. But the tribe of Simeon was filled by the creation of 2 Joseph tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, which we read about in Genesis 46, verse 20. Anytime I give some of these references and you want to pause and look up these references, please do. But I'm moving on so we can cover more material in a shorter period of time. Jacob and Rachel left Haran and took Laban's household idols with them. And Laban angrily searched for them, since these household idols were presumed to give the possessor claim to the family property. A lot of superstition involved in that story. But Rachel hid the idols, and then Jacob and Laban made up, and Laban returned to Haran. There were a few pivotal experiences in Jacob's life. One, as I've already mentioned, was the dream at Bethel, house of God. And the other was the wrestling match at Peniel, or Peniel, as it is usually commonly pronounced. Peniel in Hebrew means face of God. And you might remember that very odd so-called wrestling match that Jacob had as he prepared to meet his brother Esau. he wrestled. It's a very mysterious story. Look at it in chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. Mysterious story where Esau is wrestling with this mysterious supernatural being, sometimes referred to as a man, another time referred to as an angel, and then eventually referred to as God. But whoever it was, it's clear that Jacob interpreted this odd wrestling match as a revelation of God, either God's messenger or God himself. And as a result of this mystical, mysterious experience, Jacob's name was changed to Israel, Yisrael in Hebrew, which means God rules or God strives. And so from this day on, Jacob's limp would remind him of his encounter with God. In this wrestling match, the Lord touched him and in the hollow of his thigh and caused Jacob to limp from that day forward. So every time from this day forward that Jacob took a step, he was reminded of this mysterious encounter with God in which he strove with God, in which his name was changed to Israel. And so Jacob, from this point on, named Israel, becomes kind of a human representation of an entire nation of Israel, who strove with God, wrestled with God throughout her history. And then there was this another pivotal experience in Jacob's life. It was his reunion in chapter 33, verses 1 through 11, when finally he comes face to face with Esau after all these years. The last time he's heard from Esau, Esau was threatening to kill him. But now that Jacob has had this wrestling match with God and claims to have seen God face to face, then he sees Esau, and Esau receives him rather than retaliating against him. And Jacob says to Esau, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." Hold on one second. I think that makes the picture a little bit clearer. I hope you're impressed with the professional character of these videos. The story of Jacob is a fascinating story. I invite you to read those chapters 25 through 49 of Genesis. Fascinating stories, but also very inspirational stories too, with all kinds of parallels to our own relationships with God. The storyline is interrupted by the account in chapter 34 of Dinah's rape. Like I said, these are stories you might not want to read to your children. Dinah was the daughter of Jacob and Leah, and Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, responded in anger by killing the rapist, killing his father, and killing all the males. Then Jacob returned to Bethel, where he had uniquely experienced the presence of God some 20 years previously with that dream. And the cycle of Jacob's stories ends with another genealogy in chapter 49, I think it is. Then the last of the patriarchs is Joseph, another really fascinating series of stories that comprise the last 20 or so chapters of Genesis, chapters 30 through 50. And some of the Joseph stories, of course, overlap with the Jacob stories because Joseph was one of Jacob's sons. Joseph was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons and by far his favorite. Jacob's favoritism of Joseph came to be symbolized by that special robe that's sometimes called the coat of many colors, but scholars tell us it was actually probably known not so much for its color, but because it was a long robe with sleeves that he had made for Joseph. And so a long robe all the way down to his feet with sleeves would have only been worn for by those who did not have to work. The ordinary robe for working class people was sleeveless and only came down to the knees. So Joseph's robe is symbolic of his favored status. And of course, his brothers took a very dim view of his favored status and became jealous, and so jealous that they decided to get rid of him. So they put him in a pit and left him there. He was found and rescued by a caravan of Ishmaelites, ironically, or Midianites, and sold as if he were a piece of property to Potiphar, who was an officer of the Egyptian Pharaoh. Well, the narrative is interrupted in chapter 38 by kind of a little offline story about one of Joseph's brothers, Judah, who had sex with a woman he presumed to be a harlot, only to find out that it was his widowed daughter-in-law, Tamar, who had twin sons from her union with Judah. Usually when you see one of these stories that kind of interrupt the flow, there's some kind of weird sex story about some deviant sexual behavior. Well, the narrative picks up with Joseph years later. Potiphar's wife eventually tried to seduce Joseph, and as Joseph was trying to escape her advances because he was a noble man, she pulled off his robe and then used it later as evidence that Joseph had tried to rape her. And so for this reason, falsely charged, Joseph was imprisoned. But then, because God's favor was upon Joseph, even in prison, Joseph began to rise in rank above the other prisoners. He became a trusted prison aide. He became a dream interpreter. First, he interpreted the dreams of the king's butler and baker, and then he interpreted the dreams of the king himself. And the king became so impressed with Joseph that he promoted him from a chief prison aide to prime minister of Egypt in charge of preparations for the great famine. So Joseph really distinguished himself with remarkable, extraordinary leadership potential that was recognized, and he was promoted. And when the famine came, in Palestine, which is where Joseph's brothers were, they went to Egypt to buy grain, except for Joseph's youngest brother, Benjamin. Now, they had kind of long since presumed that Joseph was dead, since they'd left him in a pit after all. And it had been so many years that they didn't even recognize Joseph when they arrived in Egypt. But in the providence of God, he recognized them. And at first, he kind of toyed with them, making them go all the way back to Palestine and bring Benjamin back to Egypt with them. And finally, he revealed his identity to his brother, to all of his brothers, and said, "I'm Joseph." And then in chapter 50, verse 20, that verse of extraordinary grace, but also insight, where Joseph says to his brothers, instead of retaliating against them, now remember, he's in a position of prominence and power, which he supposedly could have done. Instead of retaliating against them, he was able to see how the hand of God had reunited him with his brothers, keeping God's family united. And so he says, what you meant for evil, by throwing me in that pit, by trying to get rid of me, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. That God was able to take what you did and use it for God's own glory and for God's own good purposes. The brothers then went back to Palestine and brought their father Jacob back to Egypt with them, and there was a glad reunion. That's kind of the way the book of Genesis and the patriarchal period ends. Genesis concludes the patriarchal period by describing the blessing of Jacob's sons, as well as the death and burial of Jacob and Joseph. Now, next session, session 4, we're going to pick up with the book of Exodus and move all the way through the book of Deuteronomy, covering the period of time between 1700 and 1240 BC, as we move from the people of God in Egypt to the time just on the verge of conquering the promised land, crossing over into the land of promise, the land that the Lord had promised to Abraham at the beginning of the patriarchal period in Genesis 12. I hope you're kind of keeping up with your reading. Now, this before the next time, we're going to be covering a lot of material. So you may want to wait and view the next section after you've read all that material, or you may just want to scan that material and go ahead and look at the next session next week, depending on how you want to pace this. But I hope you're tracking with us. I hope you're kind of connecting all the dots so far in the book of Genesis, the main storyline, and we'll pick up in Exodus next week.